Hi guys, Taylor Cocke here for Yahoo Esports, and I am with Dean Ayala, a member of the Hearthstone development team, and I'm going to yell at him about all my beef with the new expansion. I hope that's cool with you.
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's start off with the big beef in the early days of Journey to Un'Goro, which is the Rogue Quest deck. Because right now it feels like a lot of people are kind of complaining that it's a bit of a coin flip. If the Rogue gets their hand, they just win.
Right.
Is that something that you guys were aware of coming in, or is that something that you guys have sort of thought maybe they just haven't figured out the best way to counter this particular deck as of yet?
Certainly the Rogue Quest is one of the more dangerous ones for us, because most decks that result in a combo of a lot of damage in one turn, especially from hand and something that it's harder to interact with, those ones are pretty dangerous. But we also want to push those kinds of decks because they're also very interesting to play, and they're the kind of decks that when you play against them, sort of like Freeze Mage and Patron Warrior, it makes you think like, oh, Hearthstone is also about like this totally crazy stuff that you can do, as well as like you can just play a minion every turn and do some minion trading, or you can cast some spells to remove a minion, or you can cast some AoEs, but you can also do this like crazy stuff, like freeze the whole board for a game, and then Alexstrasza, and then cast a flurry of spells, or you can cast a bunch of 1-mana charge minions and banish a bunch of stuff, and just really unorthodox things. So having decks like that is really important to us. But on the flip side of it, when you have stuff that is harder to interact with, it can be a little bit dangerous, because when your opponent is making a bunch of 5/5s, one of the questions that you might ask yourself is like, what do I do against that? And the answer is not exactly clear. And on the flip side, the decks that are also very worrisome are, like in the past, we had Patron Warrior and Midrange Shaman, where we're sort of looking at like all of the matchups and saying, what can I play against this? Like, are there options out there? And in those cases, they're bad matchups where like 50%, Yeah. So there's not really a deck that you can play where you're like, oh, I have a really good matchup against this, or I can go and do this strategy and now I'll be successful. Whereas Quest Rogue doesn't have that problem as much. There's a variety of aggressive strategies, like even stuff like that mid-range Paladin does fairly well against them. So it's one of those things where I think time will tell in terms of there's a lot of decks that are good against Quest Rogue. And of course, it's not just about win rate. We talk about win rate a lot because that's sort of a barometer for if something is very, very high in power level. If it's like a 60% win rate deck, then that's probably something that's going to stand the test of time, and it's going to be there a month from now. Whereas Quest Rogue, it's middling. It's like 50%, and there's decks that you can play against it that are actually pretty good. So if it turns out to be like not a super high population deck, and it is showing up like 2 or 3% of the time, and it is very good against the kind of decks that are very control oriented and aren't really doing anything the first 6 or 7 turns of the game, I think that's okay. But if it turns into something that's very high populous and there's adjustments made to that Quest Rogue deck that make it good against a variety of strategies, I think that's particularly the kind of deck that we would sort of step in and change. But we're still pretty early on, and people are playing a lot of different things right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems that there is a large variety of decks that are really popping up right now. But yeah. Most prevalent are obviously the Rogue, the 2 Rogue decks. But then there's also, on top of that, there's Warrior, which is Pirate Warrior, which has been around for last expansion or so,
yes.
Last 2 expansions, and then there's Taunt Warrior. What do you? And those are sort of to consider to be also 2 of the sort of the top 4 best decks in the game right now,
right?
Generally by the community. Where do you see Warrior right now? Do you think Warrior is perhaps a bit too strong, or do you think that this is something that people are still trying to figure out a little bit?
I think Warrior is certainly in a pretty good place. I think Pirate Warrior today is less powerful than they were pre-expansion. I think a lot of those cards like Tar Creeper, and a lot of people including stuff like more things like Dirty Rat in their deck because of Quest Rogue as well. In terms of population, I think Hunter right now is the most populous just deck. I think class-wise,
it's pretty standard.
Yeah, well, I mean, Hunter previous to Un'Goro was not super low population.
I'm just thinking of the old days of Face Hunter.
Yeah, the old days. It was funny to me too, because when people are like, where's the Hunter deck? Like, there's no one's playing Hunter. It's like, well, a lot of people played Hunter for 2.5 years or something.
You had your day.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's good that all decks right now sort of have a place to shine. Even Warlock, I think the community is a bit down on right now in terms of what is the deck that you can play. But I think there's a lot of discard decks out there that are doing fairly well that I think that will eventually catch on, especially with stuff like Quest Rogue that doesn't do really anything in the first 3 or 4 turns of the game. So decks like Zeus sort of punish that. But I would say Warrior is in a pretty good spot. Just the metagame in general is in a good spot. Like the Quest Rogue, we're definitely aware it's hard to understand like what to do against it, but the population's been dropping off for the past week or so. So it's something that we're monitoring right now. But that's the only thing that I would say that we're super worried about. Pirate Warrior that's also been dropping off in population, and having an aggressive deck out there I think is a pretty good thing.
So let's talk a little bit about the idea of nerfing cards, because it's something that you guys have been really hesitant to do over time. And there are often times where you see the community, huge outcry from the community saying like, we have to nerf the Rogue Quest, just as an example. How do you guys sort of resist the temptation to jump to conclusions and say, oh, maybe we do need to do that, or is it just a waiting game? How do you guys respond to these outcries for nerfs?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely our responsibility to take into account like everyone that's playing Hearthstone. The people that consume the content the fastest generally are the ones that are having sort of an outcry for these cards to be changed. The best case scenario for us is if we get into a situation where something actually is pretty powerful, and then there are lots of options to play against it, and that tapers off over the course of a couple weeks, and then there's something else that is fairly popular because someone else figured out something that is pretty good against what was very populous at that time. So the answer should be more, there's a really popular deck that's very powerful, what can I do against it that is good against that, versus there's something that's very powerful, Blizzard comes in and nerfs those things, so I'll play that very popular thing until it gets nerfed, because what's the point in really trying to figure out like how to stop this thing if they're just going to change things every couple weeks? And especially we consider a lot of the time, sometimes there are people out there that don't have all these cards, so when you're playing against something that is pretty strong and you see it on the ladder and you're saying, well, that looks pretty fun, I'm going to start crafting towards that and crafting all of these cards. And I think that it turns into a situation where you get kind of nervous to craft anything or start building towards a deck if you're just sort of changing things left and right all the time. That said, we've also stepped in a number of times really at this point when there is stuff that is unfun to play against, usually for the most part. We rarely actually nerf things due to pure power level. I think like Undertaker was a good example of that, or like Unleash the Hounds like way back in the day. But outside of that, there's been very few huge power level outliers in terms of decks, but there has been a lot of the somewhat unfun things to play against, or the decks that don't really have a lot of bad matchups like Midrange Shaman and Patron Warrior. But I mean, our philosophy is definitely we will make a change if it is necessary, if it's healthy for the game. But for the most part, we would rather there be enough tools out there for players to figure out on their own. And sometimes there is, and sometimes there's not, and we have to make a change.
Right. And there's this weird dichotomy happening in the game right now. It's shifting subjects a little bit between there's the decks. A lot of the decks have seemed to have gotten a lot faster. The game is a little more on the aggro side, I think, but also at the same time, you guys are releasing more and more taunt minions. Taunt has become a much more popular ability in the game. How did you guys find that balance? Just because it does seem like there's this battle between taunt and aggro decks right now.
Right. Well, I guess for taunt specifically, I think we just find that as a fairly interesting mechanic. Like, players know what taunt is at this point. I think it's one of the easiest ones to understand. When you read taunt for the first time, I don't think that you would immediately understand, like, oh, that obviously means I have to attack it before I attack the enemy hero. But the fact that we have the little art piece over it, and just the way that it interacts with minions on the board, because our game is a lot about minion combat, you tend to learn what that means right away. And it adds a lot of gameplay without adding a ton of complexity, which is something we're always designing towards, like adding depth rather than complexity. So I think taunt adds to that for sure. And in terms of aggressive decks versus combo decks versus control decks, I think that'll always be sort of a dynamic that we have in Hearthstone. It's good to have both. Like, we never want games to be all control games that take 30 minutes, because I mean, if the answer to how do I beat a deck on the ladder is like, oh, everyone's control decks, then, well, I guess I'll just put in more 9 and 10 toss creatures into my deck. So it just turns into like who has more giant creatures at the end of the game, which is not a great scenario to be in. You should be able to build like, I'm going to change my strategy because this is too slow, and be faster. So I think there'll always be that dynamic in the game. There should always be a balance. It should never be, only the aggressive decks are popular and powerful, or only the combo decks, or only the control decks. It should definitely be all of them.
That relationship between the sort of the three styles of card game decks, the control, aggro, and combo, is something that has been really interesting in Hearthstone over the years. Combo has been something that's almost been looked down upon a lot of the time. Maybe you go back to the days of Patron Warrior, even Miracle Rogue is kind of a combo deck. People have always said, like, oh, there's no way to stop that. There's no interaction there. How do you guys sort of create decks that are combo decks, or create the tools in order to create combo decks that seem fair to everyone that is playing against them?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, just because there's definitely both sides of the argument. There's been a lot of people that have, there's more people that I think that say Freeze Mage is my actual favorite deck ever, or like Patron Warrior is my favorite deck ever. Like they inspire a lot of enthusiasm around those decks and like being able to play them. So I think there's definitely an outcry for people wanting to have those kinds of decks because they're super fun. And like I was saying earlier, their combo decks are some of the decks that make Hearthstone feel like the most unique, or feel like there's actually some crazy stuff that can happen in the game. But like you said, a lot of combo decks tend to do some pretty unfair things, or at least things that seem to like appear unfair. So it's just a matter of, I think those decks should exist. We should never just get rid of all of them because they, sometimes they're unfun to play against. But there should just be answers out there. Like the card pool should be enough, and there should be common and rare cards out there, and accessibility for everyone to really do something against that particular strategy. So it's always going to be a hard balance, I think, for us. But it's a balance that we're looking to try to deal with, rather than combo deck shouldn't exist or aggressive deck shouldn't exist. I think it's just a problem that we're always going to have, that we're going to have to try to solve.
Something that's been interesting about this expansion is the reception to quests as a whole, because they are the decks created around quests tend to be this sort of new format. They're building towards something at the end of the game that isn't just a big combo.
Sure.
How have you guys been feeling about the reception to quests? Because it does seem like at the beginning everyone was building quest decks. First, yep. Obviously they're the coolest, most interesting card format to come out in a long time. But in recent days, they've really fallen off. It's like it's a Rogue and Warrior are the two big quest decks, and everything else is sort of a little bit off to the wayside.
Right.
How have you guys been feeling about the way that people have been building these decks and the reception to them as a whole?
I personally think it's been super awesome. Like everyone is, sort of looking through all of the quest decks in the early days, and also quest decks are, for the most part, something that's going to get built on over time as well. So I mean, if something is not necessarily that great right now, that doesn't necessarily mean it'll be like that forever. I mean, like 1-cost cards for Hunter is sort of a wide range of things. So I mean, if it's not the best deck right now, the cards that we release in the future will really have a big impact on that. It's pretty similar to like hand buffing as well. I think hand buffing from Mean Streets of Gadgetzan is going to have a lot more longevity than something like Jade. We're probably not going to make more Jade cards. So like I think hand buffing still has a lot of room to be super powerful. But just for quests, like the Rogue deck and the Hunter deck are very powerful right now, and it's pretty populous right now. But I would be surprised if a lot of the other quests didn't also catch on. But it's okay if they all don't. Like if there's right now people are playing a lot of Murloc mid-range Paladin. That's like one of the strongest decks that we have in Hearthstone, and it's not a quest, and that's great. Because I mean, not all the one of the things that we're actually more worried about going into Ungoro is that the quest decks were going to be like all the things that people would play, and like it would all be around who got their quest reward first, and we weren't really that worried about it because we did a lot of playtesting. But that's a danger that you have when you want people to have things that aren't just quests. You don't want people to feel like, well, I don't have a quest, or I don't have the quest that I want, so I can't play. There should be like a variety of decks out there, from having aggressive strategies without the quest, and mid-range strategies, and control strategies without the quest. Like all of those things should exist. I think we're in a better spot with this metagame than honestly we've ever been. Like I've worked on every expansion from Nax on, and now, like after 2 weeks into the expansion, I feel like we're in a really awesome place.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it does seem like there is a definite wide variety of viable decks.
Yeah.
But when you guys are watching from behind the scenes when a new expansion comes out, What are some of the things you're looking for to really judge the success of that expansion in the early days? Is it just deck variety, or what are some of the other metrics that you're looking at in order to figure out the success of the expansion?
Metrics-wise, I think variety is a huge one. We want people to be playing like a wide variety of stuff, just because, I mean, even if you're not playing the thing that is super high populace, if you're running into that over and over again, like Hearthstone starts to feel, I just feel the same. And we don't want you to run into stuff like Taunt Warrior is super interesting, but if every game is Taunt Warrior versus Taunt Warrior, it becomes a lot less interesting very quickly.
Yeah.
So variety is a big deal with that, and also decks having things that they're strong and weak against is pretty important. It's a really fine line, because you also don't want everything to be 50%, because then you don't feel like your choices when you're deck building matter. And you also don't want every matchup to be Jade Druid versus Control Warrior, because that feels like, well, the match was decided before I entered the game. So you want decks to have, you know, weak and strong matchups, but you don't want it to be so polarizing that you feel like the choices that you make during the game don't matter. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty fine line, and I think like percentage-wise, when you're looking at, you know, the strong decks against this particular archetype are, you know, 58, 59, 60%. Enough to where you feel like your choices still matter. You can come back from a situation where it's like, oh, you know, this is a bad matchup for me, but, you know, if I play it right, or, you know, I get like the particular order of things that I wanted, like I still have a chance in this matchup. So decks that have strong and weak matchups that aren't, you know, super polarized, and also a lot of variety is, I think, some of the most important stuff to us.
So some of the most frustrating things in the early days of any expansion are when players aren't able to get the cards that they want in order to build their decks, and that comes as a result of, you know, Hearthstone being a card game and rarity being a thing, and particularly in Goro, when all the quest decks were for the first week it was just all quest decks.
Right.
But some people were saying like, oh, you know, because there's two legendaries in each class now, it's hard to find everything that you need from just a standard, you know, just $50 purchase of cards. Is that something that's been frustrating for you guys to watch? And also on top of that, what is the role that rarity has when you guys are designing a new set?
Certainly all the interesting cards can't be legendary. Like, it is not our objective to say like, what are the interesting cards that people are going to play? Let's make them all legendary or epic. Like, we definitely want to make stuff, especially the stuff where it's the answers. It's like, oh, hey, you know, this aggressive strategy is really popular. It's very, you know, on purpose that we made stuff like Tower Creeper common, so players can open a lot of that card and craft it at relatively inexpensive cost and have some answers to that. Quests mechanically for us just made a lot more sense for them to be, you know, one-ofs, because, you know, having 2 quests in a deck is a little bit awkward. Like, you probably wouldn't want to do that, and they start in your opening hand and that kind of stuff. And also with quests in particular, having the quest itself was a lot of the time the only piece that you needed. Like, you didn't need the legendary plus all of these other Angora cards. Like with the priest one specifically, if you do have the quest, or if you do manage to like muster up the dust to craft the quest, you can play the Death Rattle deck without having any of the rest of the Angora cards. But it is important for us that you feel like you can jump into Ungoro and start opening some packs, and we try to be having stuff like the launch event, like just the daily quests in general, the stuff when you go to standard for the first time and you have these like other bigger quests that award you a bunch of packs, and stuff like Choose Your Champion, where you can sort of like interact on the web and get packs from that. So having players be able to open up a lot of those things and opportunities for players to get more packs outside of, you know, using their gold or real money to do that. I think having enough of that is important, so players at least feel like that they're opening up enough stuff, or there's enough avenues to get all these cards if they want to, without, you know, having to break the bank to do it.
Are there other plans for you guys to be able to get more cards into people's hands? I mean, for example, in Whispers of the Old Gods, everyone was given a Cthulhu. And a few cards to be able to play with that. But that hasn't happened in this expansion, or the last one, if I recall. What was the decision behind that? Did not give people like this, here's a direction to go? Was Cthulhu sort of a failed experiment in a way, or is that something that was just very special to that particular expansion?
Cthulhu was unique and important to us because, well, specifically talking about Cthulhu, there's a lot of cards in the set that said, make your Cthulhu X. Yes. So, I mean, opening up 20 of those cards and not having Cthulhu was just an experience that felt like super bad to us. So it wasn't, I think necessarily we want to give players like more cards specifically for that reason, but just the pack opening experience of like having all these cards that say Cthulhu, but then it feels bad to have them if you don't have Cthulhu. So specifically for that mechanic that we wanted to do, it was a super fun mechanic, and it was something that we definitely wanted, and it just didn't really make sense for us if only a portion of players had Cthulhu. So we decided to give Cthulhu away for that reason. In terms of giving away a free legendary card, I think there's a lot. That's an idea. I think having more ways for players to acquire cards is like the general idea. So doing more stuff, maybe like choose your champion, or more stuff like when a new expansion releases, we have a quest that says go play mode, and we give you 5 or 10 packs or something like that. We've done that traditionally in the past. Yeah. So I think finding more avenues to just have players have access to more cards is the general idea. Whereas, giving away a free legendary is a way to do that, and something that we might do in the future. But the end goal is just having, more cards in hands of people.
I promise I'm not just trying to get more free packs out of you guys. I'm happy with the number of cards that I have. I probably spent a little too much money. It's fine. So go back to Un'Goro. Were there any decks that have popped up that have really surprised you guys? People perhaps putting something together that you super did not expect, or is pretty much everything you guys kind of figured out beforehand?
Well, we play like thousands of games, but always the community, figures out a better way than we did. And like when you hand the game over to millions of people, and there's a lot of players that I play a lot of Hearthstone, but there's a lot of players out there that are much better than me at both deck building and playing. I think designers on any game would probably say that about their population. But in terms of stuff that surprised me, I guess Shadow Visions being so popular surprised me a little bit. We knew Lyra was fairly powerful, like any resource generation card that doesn't really have a cap is going to be fairly popular. And Lyra priced at 5 mana, and Priest has like a bunch of low-cost spells. I think it was harder to see for the community, but I totally understand that. Just because once you start to see it in gameplay and generating all those resources, that's something that's pretty powerful. But Shadow Visions in particular, it's kind of 2 mana draw card. It's find a card in your deck, but at its base, it's 2 mana draw card, which isn't super good. There's not a lot of everyone's not running Flare,
right?
So Shadow Vision surprised me a little bit in terms of how often people are playing it. Like Murloc Paladin has turned out to be quite strong. There's a lot of people that are playing Murlocs in Paladin, having a lot of success, and without stuff like Finja and Bluegills, and they're just running like Vilefin Inquisitor with Adapt to Murlocs. I forget his name, Gentle Megasaur, I believe his name is. But so they're having a lot of success with that deck, which I didn't super foresee. Miracle Rogue is still quite popular. Freeze Mage is still quite popular. So those are like slight surprises, I think. But outside of that, we played a ton of games with a lot of the quest stuff, and that people are always figuring out better versions of the decks that we made, but not always just like a brand new decks. Like hopefully that we at least touch on the general ideas for decks that people make. So some surprises, but nothing super major yet.
Yeah. So when you guys are making a new set, you personally are putting together, a bunch of card ideas.
Yeah.
How many cards would you personally, before you're putting together a new expansion, how many cards do you think you personally put through like the prototyping phase and get to the point where say, hey, this might be a good idea?
Sorry, so it's like the volume of cards.
Yeah. How many? What is the sheer number of cards that you come up with for an expansion?
Oh man, it's got to be over 500. Good Lord. I mean, not like me personally, but even each person personally is doing all kinds of cards. We have, in general, this set starts with one person, which is one initial designer, who basically fills the sheet with a bunch of cards, and then more initial designers hop on later. But I think I remember Brode saying in TGT, like there's a sheet of 150 cards, and maybe only like 2 of them didn't change from the time, like either they got completely cut, completely redesigned, the numbers changed at some point. So there's very few things from like the initial 130, 140 that stick around. There's also like an insane amount of not very good ideas that might spawn a good idea, So every day, I try to email like every day, something where, hey, we need a rare priest card in the next set, so here's a bunch of ideas, and maybe one of them is good, maybe not.
So you've got to clearly there are a lot of dumb ideas that come out of this. Is there something that's been particularly like this? You've looked at it and said that this is really stupid, but I like it, and that it has managed to get into the game?
Well, I think like the wackiness of like sort of the Yogg-Saron like ended up making it in the game. Originally, we started like way crazier with Yogg-Saron, where he started out where he was. I think he started in your deck, and then you just became Yogg-Saron, but you only had 15 health. And your hero power like cast a bunch of spells. So like when you played against Yogg-Saron, it was cool. There was something there, but it started to feel not really like Hearthstone anymore, which is we sort of went away from. Medivh's initial design was gain the card text of your other minions.
Wait, what?
Which turns out is really good with like Stone Tusk Boar and Young Dragonhawk. So.
Okay, yeah.
We're like, oh, this is really interesting because then you'll get like a Ragnaros and a bunch of all these interesting death rattles and stuff, and then someone was like, what if I just put Stone Tusk Boar and Young Dragonhawk in my deck, and then you just like charge face for, like whatever, like 20 damage or something. So a lot of ideas actually end with, what if I just charged face for 25 damage? It's like, no, that's not the interesting thing that I wanted. But so a lot of times card designs end up there. But we're constantly designing all kinds of crazy ideas just in general, and hopefully something will spawn off of them that is, reasonable. Especially the initial designers tend to make stuff that is super crazy, and because final design is always kind of cutting, like this is too complex or not enough, doesn't add enough depth or not enough fun. But luckily we have a lot of people, like Broad specifically is one of the guys that you can just be like, do you have any ideas for this? And then he'll just be like, yeah, this one, this one, this one, and this one. You're like, all right, great.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Just ship it.
Yeah, basically. So we have a lot of really creative people on the team that can do that.
Is there anything that has been so complete? I mean, other than the Yogg-Saron thing, obviously, but it's something that you've come up with that is so completely off the wall that you're like, I can't even pitch this to the team.
Yeah, there was something like that recently with me. It was just like a personal thing with me. So I told a couple people this on the team, so it might be a surprise for anyone in Hearthstone watching. But it's the idea that you would turn your hand into like it would be like a 3-part sort of quest where you turn your hand into like a laser beam. And like the left side of your hand would be one part of the laser, and you could like shoot it, for like 3 damage or something like that. And then over the course of time, you'd do like an Elise thing where you'd shuffle something into your deck. Then you'd replace the right side of your hand with another beam, and you could shoot something. And then eventually, your whole hand would just get replaced by a giant laser that would shoot forward. And if a minion wasn't in the way, it would just kill the opposing hero.
That's
so that was something that I was kind of even that. Like crazy ideas that we normally pitch, I think that was something I needed to flesh out a little bit more before. So,
I think perhaps the Death Star laser on the opposing hero.
Just the idea of turning your whole hand into a giant Death Star laser to shoot across the enemy board and kill the opposing hero was amusing to me.
I'll expect that in the next expansion.
All right, I'll have to flesh out that idea a little bit more, I think. But
I know, let's just put it out as it. I think we're fine. But thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. For everyone else, this is Taylor Cocke for Yahoo Esports.